Be seated, please.
Good morning, everybody. Good to see you all this morning. For those that are visiting, our regular preacher, Scott Falkowski, is out of town with his family, and so I'm filling in. And Scott gave me the task to wrap up the book of Genesis and really the story of Joseph as we've been studying him over the past few weeks. And so that's what we're going to try to do this morning. And if you'd like to read along with me, we're going to be mainly in Genesis 50, but we're going to tack on the end of chapter 49 and a few verses in 47 here towards the beginning because they do connect into that. We're going to talk about death today. Let's just get that out of the way. This text is really notable for me because it tells the story of two deaths. And I think in a book of beginnings, like Genesis is, that's really notable because we are facing really the end of an era. And when we think about themes, I think it's not a stretch to say that death is a theme of this text. Make anybody uncomfortable when I said we're going to think about death today? You know, we don't usually just conjure up all these great and happy images when it comes to death, but ironically, what I hope we're going to end up today is that in these deaths we'll see there's hope, there's promise for the future, and there's an overall positive mood. Certainly not the things you associate with death, but stick with me. I hope that you'll follow my line of thinking as we go. So we're just going to dive right into this because we have a lot to look at. We're going to start in Genesis 47. We're going to look at Jacob's death. While we've been studying Joseph primarily, the stories of Jacob and Joseph merge back together here towards the end of the book. And in Genesis 50, we do get this major event, which is the death of Jacob. But the story kind of starts in 47. So let's start there, 47 verse 27. Jacob and his family have come into Egypt, and they're getting settled. And so at the end of that story, verse 27 of chapter 47, thus Israel settled in the land of Egypt, in the land of Goshen, and they gained possessions in it, and were fruitful and multiplied greatly. And Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. So the days of Jacob, the years of his life, were 147 years. And when the time drew near that Israel must die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, if now I have found favor in your sight, put your hand under my thigh and promise to deal kindly and truly with me. Do not bury me in Egypt, but let me lie with my fathers. Carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burying place. He answered, I will do as you have said. But Jacob said, swear to me. And Joseph swore to him. Then Israel bowed himself upon the head of his bed. Now skip down to chapter 29, verse 28. What we're skipping are a number of blessings that he's giving to his sons. And in verse 28 of chapter 49, all these are the 12 tribes of Israel. This is what their father said to them as he blessed them, blessing each with the blessing suitable to him. Then he commanded them and said to them, I am to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, in the cave that is in the field of Machpelah, to the east of Mamre in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite to possess as a burying place. There they buried Abraham and Sarah his wife. There they buried Isaac and Rebekah his wife, and there I buried Leah. The field and the cave that is in it were bought from the Hittites. When Jacob finished commanding his sons, he drew up his feet into the bed and breathed his last and was gathered to his people. Then Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel. 40 days were required for it, for that is how many are required for embalming. And the Egyptians wept for him 70 days. And when the days of weeping for him were past, Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, saying, if now I have found favor in your eyes, please speak to the ears of Pharaoh, saying, my father made me swear, saying, I am about to die. In my tomb that I hewed out for myself in the land of Canaan, there shall you bury me. Now therefore, let me please go up and bury my father, then I will return. And Pharaoh answered, Go up and bury your father as he made you swear." So Joseph went up to bury his father. With him went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his household, and all the elders of the land of Egypt, as well as all the household of Joseph, his brothers, and his father's household. Only their children, their flocks, and their herds were left in the land of Goshen. And there went up with him both chariots and horsemen. It was a very great company. When they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond the Jordan, they lamented there with a very great and grievous lamentation. And he made a mourning for his father 7 days. When the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning on the threshing floor of Atad, they said, "This is a grievous mourning by the Egyptians." Therefore, the place was named Abel Mizraim. It is beyond the Jordan. Thus his sons did for him as he had commanded them. For his sons carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the field of Machpelah to the east of Mamre, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite to possess as a burying place. After he had buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt with his brothers and all who had gone up with him to bury his father. Very impressive passage. And essentially, just to summarize, Jacob's life is over. He's been in Egypt for 17 years. He's anticipating now at 147 years old, it's time. And so he calls Joseph to make a promise to him. He does not want to be buried in Egypt. He wants to be taken back to the land of Canaan and buried in this, let's call it a family cemetery, so to speak. But not just, hey, promise me this. He doubles down and makes him swear to it. It's a very serious thing for Jacob that this is going to happen. And then when he has all of his sons gathered to him, he repeats it to all of them so everybody is on the same page. And so that's what we have. The story unfolds as Joseph gaining permission from Pharaoh for this very large company of people to travel out of the country with assurances that they'll be back. And it is amazing the support. It seems like Joseph has the full support and the full mourning of the country of Egypt. Great honor, great respect, it seems, shown to Jacob by everyone. And where we end up at the end of that text is that the sons did for him as he commanded. And yet, I summarized that last statement very succinctly because there's a lot of repetition in that text. Did you pick that up? And you can't help but see that the repetition is constantly reminding us about Abraham and about Abraham's family. And so, with that in mind, I've got kind of two questions. Hopefully you have the same ones. Hopefully they're valid questions. But first, why did Jacob go through all this trouble to be buried in Canaan? There are plenty of places in Egypt, and they're all probably nicer than some cave in a field. We've seen what Egyptian burial places look like. Those are nice. He could have had one of those, but instead he made them go through all this trouble. And a second question, why in the world did Abraham have this random cave to bury all these people in, out in a field, back in Canaan? Good questions. Let's think about those, because I think that they're interrelated. I want to answer those. I want to think about them together, but we're going to answer the second one first. And so, why did Abraham have this random cave to bury all these people in? We're not going to go read it, but in Genesis 23, it tells the story of Sarah's death. Sarah is Abraham's wife, and they are traveling through the land. She dies, and at the time they're in it's Hittite-controlled territory. So Abraham goes to the Hittites, and he says very plainly, "I am a sojourner and foreigner among you. I need to buy some land so that I can bury my wife." Abraham didn't live there, and in fact, he didn't live anywhere. If you remember and reach back into your memory banks, remember the story. He hasn't lived anywhere really for a long time. For many years, he'd been traveling, and he did this because of his relationship with God. So, the practical answer to that question is he's a sojourner and a foreigner. But I think a bigger answer to that is because of God's promises, because of his relationship with God. Get used to that phrase, because we're going to use that a lot here in the next few minutes. From the moment that we meet Abraham, God is initiating a relationship with him. And we're not going to look at all these passages, but if you're a note taker, write them down, look at them later. But he is initiating this relationship with Abraham. And in chapter 12, that's when these promises start to get made. Just so we can get them in our heads, I'm going to read a couple of verses from chapter 12. In verse 1, the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." And verse 4 simply begins, "So Abraham went," and he travels. And you can follow through that text if you read it later. You can see how he's traveling. And then when he's in the land of Canaan, this is verse 7, it says, "The Lord appeared to Abram and said, 'To your offspring I will give this land.'" But he doesn't stop there. He keeps traveling. And the entire story of Abraham is one of constant movement and travel. And there is, over the course of various encounters with the Lord, Abraham's having these promises made to him, generally along the lines of what we just read. This nation, this land, it's all looking ahead. And so for Abraham, he's responding to the promises of God. He's a sojourner on the earth. He didn't have a permanent home, and so as the need arises, he has to purchase a burial place for his wife Sarah. So we come back to our questions. The second one, why did Abraham have that cave? It's for that reason. He needed somewhere to bury his wife. He had been traveling because of the promises of God for a very long time. Which then leads me into the first question. Why did Jacob have to go through all this trouble to be buried in Canaan? Well, here's the thing about the promises made to Abraham. They didn't stop with Abraham. And that's why Jacob goes through all this trouble. Because God's promises continue beyond Abraham to his family. I'm going to have a bunch of passages up on the screen. We're not going to turn and look at those. And again, if you're a note taker, there's some longer passages that I would encourage you to check out if you're going to be thinking about this afternoon. But Abraham's son Isaac in Genesis 26 has this encounter with the Lord. And in verse 3 of 26, he says to Isaac, "Sojourn in this land, and I will be with you and will bless you. For to you and to your offspring I will give all these lands, and I will establish the oath that I swore to your father, to Abraham, your father." Here's what's interesting. Isaac doesn't just sit on that and say, "Okay, that's interesting. I'll think about it for a long time." But later on in his life, he actually communicates it to his son Jacob. He passes it on. Now, to set the context for this is after Jacob and Rebekah deceive Isaac into getting Esau's blessing. And you remember after that, Esau was not happy. He pledged to kill Jacob. And so everybody was kind of like, "Jacob, you've got to go away for a while. Go to your uncle's house out in Haran." And Isaac talks to Jacob. He says, "Find a wife while you're there." And then before you go, he gives him this blessing. Notice how it's coming in the same language as what God had spoken to him. He says, "God Almighty bless you. May he give you the blessing of Abraham to you and to your offspring with you, that you may take possession of the land of your sojournings that God gave to Abraham." Same language, same promises being passed along from father to son. And here's what's interesting. God then follows up on that with Jacob. Jacob is leaving. Right after that, he's traveling to his uncle's place. And you remember Jacob had this dream of the angels ascending and descending the ladder from heaven. And right after that, God speaks to him and says, "The land on which you lie, I will give to you and to your offspring. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you." Same promises, God speaking directly to Jacob. It's repeated a couple times. In chapter 35, God speaks to Jacob again. And then in chapter 46, right before he comes to Egypt, God visits him again and reiterates the same thing, saying, go to Egypt because this is how these promises are going to unfold. Jacob doesn't hold on to those because we see in chapter 48, this was part of the text that Scott dealt with last week, Jacob realizing right before he's going to die, he calls Joseph to himself. And in 48 verses 3 and 4, he says, God Almighty appeared to me and blessed me and said, behold, I will make of you a company of peoples and will give this land to your offspring after you for an everlasting possession. And then later on in that chapter, he says to Joseph, I'm about to die, but God will be with you and will bring you again to the land of your fathers. And so Jacob, doing the same thing that his father did to him, reiterating the same promises that God made to Abraham, Isaac, and himself, is passing that on to Joseph. And what we see here in chapter 48 is that Joseph in Egypt, as his father's dying, is directly reminded of all those promises. And I'm going to speculate and say that's probably not the first time he heard them. As a kid, before being sold into slavery, it's very likely he was aware of these, and so it's just compounding his knowledge. I took you on that ride of passages to answer our question. Why did Jacob go through all this trouble to be buried in Canaan? Because the promises of God have been a central feature of his life. They were made directly to him. They've been shared across the generations. And now in his death, he's anticipating that God's promises are going to be fulfilled. And he repeats those promises to his children. And then, by requesting to be buried in that cave, he forces everyone to come to terms with a central truth, that Egypt had been their home for 17 years, but it was not their home. It's not where they belong. And so everybody packed up their stuff and went on a little trip to bury Jacob. This is more than a story about some old guy's dying wish being granted. This is not Make-A-Wish Foundation stuff. This is a teaching opportunity that is meant to make an impact on multiple generations of his family. He's anticipating God's promises being fulfilled, and he wants them to do the same because it's who they are as God's chosen people. Let me ask you this. Do you communicate the promises of God to future generations? Are you intentionally passing these along to your children, to your grandchildren, to your unofficial family members? We all have those. You don't have to be related to them. To your spiritual family. You know, we all have a sphere of influence, whether we're related or not. And I guess I'm mainly thinking about the folks that we come in contact with among the church. This obviously extends to those that are non-Christians, but think about those sitting in this room today that you sit in this room with every week. What's interesting, and this is something that came up in our Tuesday morning men's study, we read a book with some really good research done on it that kind of says you don't have to be related to somebody to have an influence on their spiritual life. Kind of a duh moment, but it was really fascinating because it indicated that older adults among a church group can have an influence on younger people and can literally have an influence on whether they're going to serve the Lord as an adult or not. Powerful stuff, but how does that make you feel? They can play critical roles in whether a child chooses to follow the Lord or not. I'm going to get personal here for a second. Many of you have made statements to us about our son. For those that are visiting, we have a 7-week-old sitting there with his mom in the back. And the statements have been made, he's going to have a lot of grandparents here. Awesome. We love it. Nothing wrong with that at all, and I think that's great. But you know what I want more than giving him hugs and pinching his little cheek and all the stereotypical grandparent things that you do? I want you to be spiritual mentors to him. I want you to exercise your influence on him from a spiritual standpoint so that when he's on his deathbed like Jacob, he eagerly looks forward to the fulfillment of those. And this is not just the youngest ones. Anybody younger than you can have an influence. I think Jacob was 40 years old when he left home, and his father was communicating these promises. But I think we get the point, right? Are you doing these things? Through Jesus, just bringing it home to us today, we're the recipients of these promised blessings to Abraham. So today, as we sit here in 2021, we are, kind of, Randy, what you're talking about in class today, we're seeing the things that Solomon couldn't see. We're seeing the things now that Abraham couldn't. We know how this story unfolds. We know the ultimate fulfillment of these promises. That's what they were looking forward to. This is what we are looking forward to. And we have a lot of people that we can share those blessings with. And so it's a tall order. It's a humbling task, I think, when we think about what this family was doing and then what we can do as a result of that. Joseph, sorry, that's a lot smaller than I thought it would be. Joseph's going to die next. Jacob's not the only person that dies in this story. And maybe just to build on what we were just talking about, Joseph is also the recipient of this intergenerational communication of God's promises. Abraham to Isaac to Jacob to Joseph. And as Jacob's dying, he tells these things to Joseph. And I think without a doubt, this is another just like obvious statement if you've been studying Joseph with us. Joseph is aware of God's presence in his life. And at his death, he does the same thing. He anticipates God's promises being fulfilled. Let's read this text. It's Genesis 50. And we're going to skip a paragraph. We'll come back to it in a second. But this is Genesis 50, verse 22 beginning. So Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's house. Joseph lived 110 years. And Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the third generation. The children also of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were counted as Joseph's own. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry my bones from here. So Joseph died, being 110 years old. They embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. Did you see the language there? Verses 24 and 25. Same language, same promises, same hope. And Joseph was absorbing all of this from his life. And yet the end is a little different, isn't it? He doesn't arrange for some grand procession to take him out and bury him in that cave. But instead, he's embalmed. He's put in a coffin in Egypt. And maybe it's a little sad. There's an element of sadness to it, but it's also really exciting if you read it from their perspective, because there's this confident expectation of what's coming. Joseph knows that the Lord is working to fulfill his promises. We'll get into that more in a second. But he's essentially saying, don't take me now. I can wait, because you're going to be going. Swear to me that you'll take me. And he does that to his brothers. If there's one thing that Joseph knows about, it's how God works quietly behind the scenes to bring his purposes about. Think about Joseph's life, and we're going to review in a second. But God working quietly behind the scenes to bring his purposes about, Joseph's the living embodiment of that, is he not? So if there's one overarching takeaway for me at the end of Joseph's life, it's that he saw the spiritual perspective in everything he did. He knew God was present, and he knew God was active. Consider these statements made by Joseph during his life, if you can read them. It'll look better on a computer screen when it's right there in front of me. But this is the statement he makes when Potiphar's wife is seducing him and trying to get him to commit adultery with her. And he's saying, I can't do that. And the statement he makes is that, how could I do this great wickedness and sin against Potiphar? Against God. He saw that act to be very specifically against God. When the baker and butler were in prison, and Joseph's in charge of the prison, and he sees the sadness on their faces, and he says, "What's wrong with you guys?" They say, "Well, we've had dreams, and no one can interpret them." And Joseph says, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell them to me." He gives the credit to God there. When Joseph makes it to Pharaoh, and he's standing in front of Pharaoh, and Pharaoh had dreams too. Pharaoh says, "I've heard it was said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it." Joseph says to Pharaoh, "Yep, I'm really good at that." No, he says, "It's not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer." And then as he unfolds the telling of that dream, God has revealed to Pharaoh what he's about to do. God has shown to Pharaoh what he's about to do. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. To me, there's no doubt in Joseph's mind who's working here. When he has children, Ephraim and Manasseh, he names them, and it tells us what their name means. Manasseh, he names him that because he says, "God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house." With Ephraim, "God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction." God did all this for me, and I'm going to name my kids so that we can remember that. And then when his brothers finally come to see him and he reveals himself to them, and they're horrified and they're expecting the worst, he says, "Don't be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh and lord of all his house and ruler over all the land of Egypt." Powerful statements made by Joseph. He knew God was present. He thought spiritually about his own actions. He knew God was active. He believed God was working in ways that he didn't know or understand, but he attributes it all to him. So when he dies, of course, he believes that the promises would be fulfilled. Of course, he makes arrangements for his bones at death because this is how he thinks. This is how he lived his life, and this is how he's going to live his death. I think the thing about Joseph sometimes is that it always seems easy, right? We read about all these great decisions that the guy made, and it just seems so easy. But I'm sitting here thinking, well, it's easy to do at death, Joseph, when you have nothing to lose. But what about during life? Well, he did it during life too. And even when circumstances for him changed, and others might have been tempted to lose their focus, Joseph doesn't do it. And that's what we're going to see here in verses 15 through 21. I want to end up thinking about Joseph's life instead of Joseph's death as we look at this paragraph here between Jacob and Joseph's death. There's this interesting little story. So let's read that, Genesis 50, verse 15. Remember, Jacob just died. And when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "It may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him." So they sent a message to Joseph saying, "Your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, 'Please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin because they did evil to you. And now, please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father.'" Joseph wept when they spoke to him. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, "Behold, we are your servants." But Joseph said to them, "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear, I will provide for you and your little ones." Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. When Jacob died, the brothers feared that this act quote unquote, that Joseph had been putting on for 17 years was finally going to go away. And he was finally going to get his revenge. That's probably what they would have done, right? And so they pleaded for forgiveness. You can see their desperation just clearly on the page, to the point that it seems like they're even making stuff up about things that Joseph told them before he died, or that Jacob. I've probably been mixing them up, and I apologize, but they seem to be saying Jacob said this to them. It seems like they're making it up. Regardless, they're desperate. What would you have done? Well, Joseph's response, I think, is opposite from what they expected. It's probably opposite from what we would do. But I think after looking at his life, it's very much in keeping with his behavior as someone who sees with spiritual eyes and someone who believes that God is active. And so in verse 17, it says that he wept when they spoke to him, almost like he's sad that they would even think of such a thing. In verses 21, he says, I'll provide for you and your little ones. It's okay. And it says he comforted them and he spoke kindly to them. And then the big verse, the most powerful statement, is that made in verse 20. You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. Am I in the place of God to take this revenge? All those years ago, he says, you did evil to me, but God was planning good. And because of what you did, a lot of people are still alive today, including you. It took a long time, I'm sure, for Joseph to really feel that way, and it only made more sense with time. But the way he says that, there's no doubt in his mind. And we have, again, the benefit of time and distance ourselves. As we look at this story, we know that this was an important step to God's promises unfolding. The Israelites lived and grow, and they thrive in Egypt for 400 years before leaving to claim that promised land, where ultimately the blessings promised to the descendants of Abraham comes about. And ultimately, where does that culminate? It culminates in Jesus. And you can almost see the chain of events happening all the way back here at the beginning. Indeed, God meant it for good. Joseph's role in this, his continued forgiveness of his brothers, the grace that he shows them, it helped fulfill the promises of God. And I think he implies that to act otherwise would have put him contrary to God's purposes, to lash out at his brothers, to not see God working in his life. It's almost as if he's implying, I might have been working against God. Think about this question for yourself in this context. What if, by not living with a spiritual perspective, you put yourself in the way of God and his promises? Taking revenge on somebody, giving into temptations, not giving God credit, all the things that Joseph could have done instead of what he did. What if you did that? And what if you found out that you were putting yourself in the way of God? The best part about this story is we know God can overcome that. We know that God can overcome your evil actions, your evil intent, my evil actions, other people's evil actions, and still bring good about. That's I think the ultimate takeaway here. But still, that's such a sobering thought to think that we could be doing that. I pray that we can see things like Joseph did throughout his life, but also at the end of his life. So, I've been studying Joseph for a long time. We talked a lot about Jacob, though, didn't we? To bring Joseph's story to an end. But I think that Joseph's life and his death make very little sense if you don't understand everything that comes before it, which is why we went on that little journey this morning. And with both deaths being recorded in such a small space in the text, there's got to be some intent in the author's mind. And so this is what's making sense to me. I hope it made sense to you. Both men exhibited powerful faith in their deaths. And Joseph, in his life, exhibited what might feel like unmatchable faith. But ultimately, whether in life or in death, we are called to live our lives with the same faith of Joseph, Jacob, of Isaac, of Abraham. Seeing God present, seeing God working, living as if he is really there, living with his promises in mind, and ultimately dying with his promises in mind. Here we go again. Let's talk about death for a second. Have you thought about your own death in light of this text? How are you going to approach it? We're all going to die. It's in our future, each and every one of us. And for some, you might be able to gather your family around and communicate to them like Jacob and Joseph did. For others, it's going to come unexpectedly. That's just what happens. I'm making anybody uncomfortable. Jacob and Joseph spoke plainly and openly about their deaths. Why did they do that? Why weren't they uncomfortable, as we often seem to be? I'm going to suggest it's because of the promises, because they knew there was more to the story than just what they were experiencing. I love the statement that Jacob makes when he's about to die. He says, I'm about to be gathered to my people. And when he dies, it says he was gathered to his people. And to me, that carries some weight of, I'm going somewhere where there's other people. It's a really cool image, and I think ultimately it conveys the idea that there's more to it than just this. And when he's basing that and rooting that in the promises of God, that's powerful. Can you approach your death like that? See it not as the end, but as a beginning? Have peace and anticipate an eternity in the presence of God. Trusting in Jesus' blood and God's grace to wash away your sins. Anticipate that God will fulfill his promises to you. Go to heaven. Tom, good songs this morning to start us off. Tight and well. We sang about that, and I was like, I got to write that down somewhere so I can remember it. Can we approach our death like that? I think we can, but as we're looking at this story here, I think it's inextricably connected to how we live our lives, just like Joseph. So the second question, how are you going to live your life? Jesus died so that you can have a full and deep relationship with God, one without sin that creates a separation, one with hope. It begins with faithful submission to him through baptism, accepting the free gift of his grace. It continues by living in an ever-deepening relationship in which you learn to see things through spiritual eyes, faithfully following him and trusting him. And it's not going to be easy, as Joseph shows us. It involves denying yourself. It involves being nice to those who are mean to you. It involves plainly stating that you're a stranger whose home is not of this world. It involves the inability to see God working to fulfill his promises. Even when it's happening, you may not be able to see it. You can live that way, or you can focus on the here and now. You can rely on yourself. You can disregard God's presence and role in the world. That's a way you can answer that question. But those questions are ever before us. And so as we end up this study of Joseph, how can we summarize it? Live like you see God. Try to see his perspective. Give grace to the undeserving, even if they sold you into slavery. God is working out his plan. You can't see it. It takes time, but he is working. And then have this confidence in life so that you can have the same confidence in death. Tom.
Thank you, Aaron.